everyone, welcome to Introduction to Cozy Science Fiction and Fantasy, currently used definitions. So I am Ethel Duff Cooper. I am a cozy fantasy and cozy science fiction author, avid reader, and independent scholar of the genre as well. So I have basically got a lot of interest in this genre. And I wanted to kind of talk about that for a little bit, for a couple of reasons. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. So as you can see from the title, I am talking very specifically about science fiction and fantasy rather than speculative fiction or including horror in the acronym that I'm using, which is honestly just down to the fact that I am not a horror reader, and even though cozy horror in my experience has at least some overlap with what I'm about to say, because I don't have a background in horror and because horror does a couple of things that are extremely paramount for it to be considered horror that science fiction and fantasy don't necessarily do, otherwise they'd be horror, I don't feel like I am the right person to talk about what specifically cozy horror is and what cozy horror does. And science fiction and fantasy in this case also has a very clear set of overlap between how readers treat it, which horror doesn't. Horror tends to get met with confusion from what I understand, because cozy horror don't seem to go together. But that's roughly as far as my extent goes, so that's why I'm not talking about horror, but specifically science fiction and fantasy. Secondly, as you may have noticed from the fact that I write it, read it, and then study it in my free time for fun and giggles, and also occasionally profit, I am fairly well versed in cozy science fiction and fantasy and the trappings and the tropes that make it work. So I have set up a couple of videos where I'm like, these are current issues that the genre is dealing with, more or less, and these are points that I think people would find interesting, but I am too well versed to really understand what people want to know. So if there's anything that you really specifically want to know about cozy science fiction and fantasy, drop it in the comments, and I will at minimum try to make kind of like a FAQ kind of video based on that to, answer those questions, because I think this is fun and hopefully you all do too. Thirdly, there is a chance that at some point in this video I will need to go say hello to Sir Hiss or to Fraught, my two cats, because they can climb up on the window shelf behind me. Window shelf. What am I saying? There's a shelf behind me and then there's a windowsill. And there's a shelf over there as well. So lots of places for the cats to go. Sometimes they also lie on the desk. Shouldn't happen too much. It's much more likely that I will have to re-record the entire video because it doesn't really pause very well, and I don't do well with getting my train of thoughts back when I do pause, because Sir Hiss jumped on something he's not allowed to. Fraught, bless her, doesn't like high places. She's a very weird cat. Anyway, so there may be cats. I predict there will be no cats, but there may be. Let's see what else. And I will get distracted by the cats, which is honestly the main point for bringing this up, is no matter how professional I will try to be, once there are cats, that goes out of the window. It's cats. They're so cute and adorable. And Sir Hiss is not allowed on my lap because he will just... I'm wearing linen and he has very, very sharp claws. Poor Sir Hiss, I know. But yeah, so I think that's roughly all the housekeeping that I've got. So I want to talk about the currently used definitions, mainly because there are a couple of definitions that are in use, 3 to 4 depending on how you want to count it, with 2 of them being fairly major and one of them being falling out of use a little bit, more or less, kind of, sort of. It's complicated, it's nuanced, it's fun. Trust me, I like this. It's going to be fun, I promise. But yeah, so these definitions don't necessarily align very well, which leads to a lot of trouble when you try to discuss cozy science fiction and fantasy. And I see people running into this over and over and over again, because everybody's using a slightly different definition. So that's kind of why I want to look at what is the definition of cozy science fiction and fantasy, and who uses them, why do we use them, all that kind of fun stuff. So to that end, I am in the wrong screen. It's a fun part of having multiple screens and multiple stuff in there. So to that part, I have three main definitions lined up here. We have the reader's definition. This is by far the most commonly used and also the most easy to misuse. We'll get to that. We also have the marketing department's definition of cozy science fiction and fantasy, and we'll see. You'll see. And then we have the writer's definition. This is the definition that I use as a writer when I talk about the craft, as well as the one that I use when I talk about cozy science fiction and fantasy in a, in a more academic or a critical situation, because this one is actually useful for talking about cozy science fiction and fantasy. We'll see why. So first up, we have, of course, the reader's definition. So as I said, this is the main definition that people use, and this is probably going to be the one that you were thinking was going to come up. More or less. As I said, everybody uses this one slightly differently. And that is because the reader's definition is predominantly subjective. I actually put it all the way down at the slide, but this is a definition that we can summarize more or less as a sentence like, did this book that I am reading right now upset me, the person who is literally reading this book right now? Yes or no? If the answer to that question is yes, then the book by definition can no longer be cozy science fiction or fantasy. If the answer is no, then no matter what you put in the book, by definition it must be cozy science fiction or fantasy. Okay, that's not quite how it works, but if you want to do like a very, very strict, easy breakdown, black and white kind of breakdown, this is what you're going to go with. And this all stems from the fact that the reader's definition that most of us use when we talk about cozy science fiction and fantasy, and the one that is most used in like mainstream discussions on cozy science fiction and fantasy as well, is because this definition is basically nothing but vibes. It is, does this book vibe as cozy to me? Yes. Then regardless of what is in there, you can call the book cozy, and you can consider it cozy science fiction and fantasy. This is, as you could probably tell, not a great definition to use if you want to have any kind of discussion. But we do have a heck of a lot of books that people will call cozy and then respond to with like, this is not cozy, and that, have gained prominence as cozy books. So we can find some common threads and common ground between what these books do and what, therefore, readers consider cozy. So I'm gonna have to look at the screen away from the camera some of the time, just because otherwise I can't read what I'm doing. Anyway, so we have the vibe, as I said, is also sometimes the visual aesthetic. And that is used like the cottagecore aesthetic, the Studio Ghibli aesthetic. Once someone uses that, there is a chance that people are just going to throw it into cozy fantasy and call it a day. It is also, and this one is actually fairly important, predominantly fantasy. There is cozy science fiction being written. I have at least 2 cozy science fiction books out there, and I am not the only person. I can think of like Water into Wine by Joyce Cheng, and what's A Slice of Mars by Garrick Haché, which I probably mispronounced, I'm sorry. But those are 2 very prominent cozy science fiction books. Point being, this is a genre that does exist. It is in the minority. What took off in about 2020 was, the fantasy books, and science fiction kind of gets ignored. It doesn't, if it's cozy science fiction, it tends to get thrown into cozy fantasy somehow, or it gets to be rewritten to be that, or whatever. It's very often, especially nowadays, it is very often also romance. It is very often cozy fantasy romance in particular. And this is because there's a fair bit of overlap between how to write a good cozy fantasy book and a good romance story. We'll get to that in another point. I have an entire essay on Strange Horizons on it if you want to read it in more detail. But the point is that nowadays a cozy fantasy book or a cozy science fiction book, people expect romance in there because the vast majority of what they read in the cozy genre is going to be cozy romance specifically. So that's why that is there. We also have the idea that cozy science fiction and fantasy cannot have any kind of tension or conflict, and if it does have any kind of tension and conflict, it resolves itself in at most like 2 pages. This ties in with the next point down there, which is that it cannot include or even acknowledge any kind of heavy topics, which goes for the very obvious, like on-page torture that is delivered very graphically. This is an absolute no-no when it comes to cozy science fiction and fantasy, but it also extends to things like someone experiencing a microaggression and the book casually just including it because that's reality for that author and the character that they're writing, so that it's just in there and it doesn't really register as anything. Well, as a microaggression, but it doesn't really register as, oh, this stops making it cozy. They're also very often described as twee, shallow, vapid, saccharine. I personally like saccharine, cutesy, lots of those types of words, and pretty much always in a negative way, which with some of these words you don't necessarily get. Like saccharine can be very positive if that's what you're looking for. But most of the time when people talk about cozy science fiction and fantasy, they're using these words in a derogative, negative way. These books are also very often all about food, and if they're not about food, they are most likely going to be about a library or a bookshop. And you can see that kind of in the next point as well, which is that they're very often set in a community-centric kind of shop, which very often means like a cafe, a restaurant, or a library, a bookshop, somewhere where people come together and hang out. They also tend to have like anachronistic D&D inspired settings, especially the ones that were written after Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. They don't have to, and you can get this as a package, like they are anachronistic D&D kind of settings, or they can be one or the other, but they come together. And some of that is just like the convenience of it. But yeah, so those are some of the points that many people consider important in a cozy science fiction or fantasy book, especially a cozy fantasy book. But you don't have to have like any of these in there, and you can have them in any kind of variation or level that you want, because it's complicated. But for our definition, the reader's definition, this is roughly what we're going with. And the more of these points it hits, the more likely it is that it is going to end up being called a cozy fantasy book by a reader. So that's roughly what we're going with. We also have the bad faith takes, which, as far as I can tell, is where most mainstream criticism of cozy science fiction and fantasy comes from. And I don't want to get into this one too much because it is a lot. But I want to point out that when it is a bad faith take, it is largely, if not solely, applied to queer cozy science fiction and fantasy. It is very often queer-phobic and especially aphobic rhetoric wrapped up in genuine criticism that you can make of cozy science fiction and fantasy. And some of that is just criticism of what the genre does, rather than, any kind of legitimate criticism. Although you can criticize what the genre does, I suppose. It's complex. But a lot of the time, if you see mainstream discussions of what is cozy, especially if there is nothing but negativity in there, it is very much worth asking if it comes from this bad faith take. Because the worst of the bad faith take is nothing at all to do with the books or the genre itself. It boils down to you are being queer the wrong way. And asexuals aren't queer. That kind of vibe is what they're going for. Which is, again, as you can see, probably not really kind of the thing that I want to get into. I just want people to be aware that it is a thing that exists and that does happen. So then we have marketing's definition. Marketing's definition is interesting. You may have gathered that from when I tried to introduce it earlier. marketing's definition, I will say I have kind of lost track of the differing ways in which marketing uses the definition specifically since it moved to romantasy. But marketing's definition is roughly summarizable as, I don't know, would it sell the book if we slap the word cozy on it? Yes, cool, we're using the word cozy. No, we're not using the word cozy. Done. And what is in the book or what is not in the book doesn't really matter. Yeah, that's marketing. We're done. So now we have the writer's definition. The writer's definition is by far the most objective definition that we can find, and it's an interesting one. So the first thing to note when it comes to the writer's definition is that cozy science fiction and fantasy more or less sort of kind of vaguely exists on a spectrum. My graph skills are not great, but hopefully you get the gist of it. We have cozy science fiction and fantasy, which is about where's the camera? Big, and we reduced it to about big. So we have what I call rosy sweet or rosy bright science fiction or fantasy, cozy science fiction or fantasy, depending on the day and which word I remember. And this is what people will associate with like the twee, cutesy, saccharine, blah blah blah. That kind of cozy science fiction and fantasy vibe that people probably were thinking of when they heard cozy science fiction and fantasy in the introduction before I started to define everything. That's a tiny part of the entire genre. You also have what is currently called cozy adjacent or cozy with a bite, which is basically everything else which exists in every variation that you can find, but that does deal with potentially heavy topics, or that does include, tension and conflict in a way that people are not necessarily expecting from a cozy book, if that tiny 10% is what they're thinking of. So we need to account for the vast majority of cozy, because it's clearly not captured in that one definition that we've been using. Writers do that, and critics do as well. I spent an entire weekend analyzing every single description and summary I could find from critics and authors, trying to describe what they thought would require a cozy book, and they all kind of agree, but they kind of have like different ways of phrasing it, or like very slightly different angles to what they're looking for, but you can roughly summarize it down to these 5 points. So we start off with tone and vibe, because as much as I dislike that the reader definition that we use is nothing but tone or vibe, it is actually genuinely important. If you are not selling the tone or the vibe that this is going to be a cozy book, then people are not going to register it as a cozy book. If you manage to sell that, vice versa is also true. Something I run into as an author is sometimes I don't write cozy books, and I have thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, up to and including murdering a pregnant dog on page. Well, I think it was on page. It might have been slightly off page, but it was definitely very obviously in there to kind of signal this is not a cozy book. But because I tend to be known for cozy books, some of the readers were like, oh, this is a lovely cozy romance. It's like, no, that's not what I was going for. So it works vice versa too. If you are known for writing cozy books and you're trying to write something else, then you have to work twice as hard to make sure that readers have the right idea of what kind of books that they're reading, because otherwise they will kind of bring in assumptions from other books that you've written, that they have read, into what you're doing. So that's really interesting and fun, but it's why tone and vibe is very important. If you don't land that, none of the rest down there matters. Cozy science fiction and fantasy tends to have low or personal stakes. This is where we very often get the idea that there is no tension in there. But there can definitely be tension in there. It's just the stakes are not, oh my god, I'm saving the world. It's Sarah Beth Durst from The Spell Shop. I don't remember the exact quote, but the way that she put it in an interview, at least I think it was an interview rather than an article, but the way that she defined this aspect, these stakes for cozy science fiction and fantasy was, You're not trying to save the world. You're trying to save one single soul. And you can have multiple souls, obviously, but the point is the scale is much smaller, which also leads into the next point of domesticity. Because the scale is much smaller, you have much more space to look at everyday life and how people do household chores and stuff like that. You don't get a lot of those, but this is why there's a higher element of it than in other books. You also get community and relationships. Both of these can be conveyed with food. It's in the next video that I want to do, but you get both of these by including food very easily, which is why cozy science fiction and fantasy has cafes and restaurants and baking as often as it does. The one thing that I will say that you do also need, rather than just a tone, is the ending. A cozy science fiction and fantasy book needs to end better than it began. Which kind of, if you want a slightly easier way to put that, is you need to have a happily ever after or a happily for now, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a romantic one. Your main character does not have to be paired up with one or more people by the end of it and be in a happy romantic sexual relationship. You don't need that. But you do need for people to be happier than they were at the start of the story. And that's basically it. That's a quick introduction to all these definitions. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this interesting. Again, if there is anything you want me to talk about, let me know in the comments and I can make a video about that, or make a video about it along with other points. We'll see how it goes. But until next time, I hope you have a lovely time. And until then, goodbye!